So my name is Kevin Sheehan. I am an architect on the EUC customer success team. Been with VMware for a couple of years, and my focus has primarily been on Identity Manager and Workspace ONE during that time frame. I had the pleasure of writing the first reference architecture for Workspace ONE, so if you get a chance, go download that. It's a little bit long in the tooth. It was published about a year ago, so there are certainly some things that have changed in the meantime, but it definitely would help out for people who maybe get a little bit of exposure to Workspace ONE here, but would like to get a little bit more exposure going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. Adash Kasari, Senior Systems Engineer. I'm based out of Atlanta. I've come from the mobility side of the AirWatch organization and through into Workspace ONE and identity management. And what we want to take you through in this session is a deployment deep dive, specifically around best practices in architecture around the Workspace ONE solution, things you must consider on your way through as you deploy your Workspace ONE environment, and then going through troubleshooting. And we're actually going to go through everything from console-based troubleshooting all the way through to the device. So we want to make sure that you have the right steps to troubleshoot your environment all the way through.
I know there'll probably be a lot of questions as we go through the content. If we could, please try to hold them to the end. And if you do have questions, please use the microphone because we're recording this so that we can make sure we get good fidelity out of the session. So obvious disclaimer, everything that we're going to be talking about for the most part is currently shipping. Everything that we'll show is based on the current version of Identity Manager, current version of AirWatch, and the current version of the Workspace ONE applications. But if we do talk about any futures, obviously you need to make sure you're not making any buying decisions based on anything that we say, because plans can change from time to time. As Adash said, the agenda is really that we want to start off by talking about some of the architectural considerations for a Workspace ONE implementation. There's a couple different models for deployment, so we want to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of what those models look like. We're then going to go in and cover some of the basics from a troubleshooting standpoint, some of the first steps that you'll take if you start running into issues within an Identity Manager and Workspace ONE implementation. We'll then go in and look specifically around single sign-on and some of the things that break the mobile single sign-on experience. Look at some of the device issues that can come up from time to time, and then throughout the entire session we'll kind of throw up what are common errors that people tend to see and give you some suggestions about where those usually come from. So when you look at an Identity Manager implementation, there's really a couple of different architectural models that come into play that customers might look at doing a deployment with. So one of them is the idea of a cloud-hosted model, where VMware hosts all of the components, except for a couple of components that you put on premises in order to be able to handle authentication, authorization, and app entitlements. There's also two different on-premise implementations that come into play. So again, we'll get into the details of what each one of these looks like. One of them is all of the components for the solution being deployed internally, and then the other one is a split model with some components that are deployed on the corporate network, some are in the DMZ, and then there are some conditions where you might actually do a hybrid of all three of those particular implementations based on your requirements. There's no right or wrong answer for what the right architecture is. So when I did that reference architecture, we actually looked at a couple of different scenarios around how a deployment might go. And it was really driven by the fact that different things like authentication requirements and the different types of applications that your end users are going to access will start dictating what the most appropriate implementation might look like. There's also things like edge technologies that you'll need to consider. What's your application access look like to get from a device that's an internet-based device in order to gain egress inside your network? We'll talk about some of those considerations. And then, the other kind of propensity that a customer may have for cloud-hosted solutions. In some cases, we get regulated customers that simply say, we can't do cloud, everything has to be an on-premise implementation. And then we have other customers who are very interested in doing a cloud-hosted solution and moving everything that they can out of the data center. Those might be some of the other decision points that will often come up. There are literally dozens of ways for a Workspace ONE implementation to be put together. We have some guidance and architectural diagrams that you'll see online, and if you include all of the components that are found between Identity Manager and AirWatch, as well as all of the devices, and then all of the application types that you might expose through a Workspace ONE, you literally could be standing up 15, 20, 30 servers for a really large implementation. So anything that we talk about here is designed to be some general guidance around operational principles with the understanding that everything's always going to change a little bit based on the specific requirements you might have. We're also going to throw in a new and interesting wrinkle. So quick show of hands, how many people have deployed a identity manager appliance today? Okay, so about half. How many people knew that there was a Windows version of Identity Manager? So significantly less. So this is a brand new kind of late-breaking thing that we shipped with the latest version of AirWatch. The way that you get the Windows-based Identity Manager installation is by taking the, what is it, 292?
Correct, 291.
291 install files, and then when you go through the installation, one of the things you'll see is that in the AirWatch installation, there's a new node that says you can go ahead and install Identity Manager. This is a full Windows install of all of the components that you would normally see as part of the Linux-based implementation, with one exception. We don't include the KDC that we use for mobile single sign-on for iOS as part of the Windows installation. So we have a hybrid model of allowing you to do the installation of the Windows components and then connect to a cloud-hosted KDC that we use in order to be able to make sure that you can offer the same feature parity between the Linux-based implementation and the Windows-based implementation. When you do the installation, it can install into two different modes. One of them that we refer to as the lightweight mode is essentially a deployment that is designed to be a replacement for the AirWatch app catalog and uses the Workspace ONE client application on your end users' devices. It's a very limited implementation because it doesn't include support for all of the functionality that you would expect in a true Workspace ONE implementation. It's really just giving us an opportunity to move away from having the app catalog and the Workspace ONE app, and instead move to one consolidated code base that takes advantage of the Workspace ONE app itself. But there are, obviously a lot of great capabilities that are tied into it. If you do this implementation, you'll never see an Identity Manager console. All of the configuration for this mode is done using the AirWatch console. The other mode, the second deployment mode, is the idea of a full Identity Manager installation. During the installation, there's a checkbox which says install the full Identity Manager install, and then at that point it will install all of the components that make up the Identity Manager product. This will then give you all of the functionality that you would expect, things like the ability to do mobile single sign-on, the ability to do conditional access. You will manage this using the same web console that you use in the Linux-based appliance. The difference is everything is running on Windows. The reason we bring this up is it really is brand new, and we're getting a lot of questions now about what's the right way to go. And like everything else, it really depends. We have several large customers who are moving as many of their services up into the cloud, and they're using Amazon Web Services or Azure as a means of being able to provide that infrastructure. Obviously, we can't deploy the OBA into those environments, so this is certainly one of the reasons that the Windows appliance makes a lot of sense. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of AirWatch customers have AirWatch deployed. They're interested in Workspace ONE, but maybe they don't have an ESX infrastructure in place, and they don't have the expertise to be able to deploy and support Linux-based appliances. So for those customers, it's obviously a much friendlier model for allowing them to be able to go ahead, do the installation, and run everything in a Windows-based environment that they're used to. We'll give you a quick demo of what some of this looks like as we go through the rest of the presentation, but I wanted to call that out. In all of the architectures that we put up here, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the Windows-based installation or the Linux-based installation. The components and capabilities that we'll talk about are essentially identical across both platforms. So if we start tearing down a little bit deeper into each of the deployment models. So we'll start off by talking about the cloud deployment model because it is the simplest implementation. With the cloud-hosted model, VMware runs the Identity Manager service hosted in the cloud. We have 3 regional data centers around the world to support VMware Identity.com, VMW Identity.com .eu and .asia, run out of the US, out of Ireland, and out of Japan. And then we also have the AirWatch cloud tenants that will also be hosted in a number of data centers around the world. In order to then be able to handle things like authentication, We have two different connectors that have now been bundled into one installation file called the Enterprise Systems Connector. You get to this through the AirWatch console. When you go in the past you would have gone in and downloaded just the AirWatch Cloud connector, but now we have this thing called the Enterprise Systems Connector that includes both the Identity Manager connector and the AirWatch Cloud connector. The Identity Manager connector connects to your Identity Manager tenant. The AirWatch Cloud connector connects to your AirWatch tenant. This gives us the ability to do authentication through either one of the connectors. So you've got a lot of flexibility, again, based on the deployment model and the types of applications your users are accessing. We also take advantage of the cloud connector for things like certificate distribution. So if you've got your internal CA that you need to use for distributing certificates for certificate auth or for mobile single sign-on, the ACC is responsible for that as well. The red lines in here are related to access to a Horizon environment. So if you're planning to expose Horizon-based applications to your end users, you would need some egress technology, whether it be an F5 or be Unified Access Gateway or some other component that will then allow proxying to your connection server and then synchronization of entitlements between the connection server and the Identity Manager server.
And I think the big thing here is, if you've got an AirWatch environment that's already in the cloud and you're coming through these decision matrix around how do I deploy my Workspace ONE environment and Identity Manager, if you've got AirWatch in the cloud, it makes the most sense to put Identity Manager in the cloud alongside it. You've got the best availability there, and use the AirWatch Cloud connector, the installation component for the VMware Enterprise Systems Connector that has the Identity Manager components to connect back to your Active Directory and those on-premises authentication providers that you have.
So then the next model is a model where we would host all of the components that make up a Workspace ONE implementation inside the firewall on the corporate network itself. This was probably one of the more common implementations that we saw over the past couple of years, and it was often driven by the fact that customers maybe started with the Workspace Portal product back in the Workspace Portal 2.1 timeframe, and then rolled it forward into Identity Manager up to the current 2.9.1 release.
Or they had an AirWatch environment on-prem.
Or they had an AirWatch environment on-prem.
That's the other big use case there.
So once people had some of those components already installed on their corporate network, it then turned into a situation of how do we provide internet access for those devices to then be able to have egress, to be able to communicate with the Identity Manager appliance and also to the AirWatch device services environment. At the same time, we also continue to have this functionality of exposing your Horizon-based applications. So again, we'd rely on a technology in the DMZ that would be responsible for being able to proxy connections. We don't see this particular implementation quite as much as we look at most of the deployments that are happening right now. Instead, we tend to see this sort of an implementation. So in this implementation, what we do is we put the Identity Manager appliance in the DMZ, we put the AirWatch device services servers in the DMZ, we provide an egress mechanism such as UAG to allow access into a Horizon environment. The reason this particular implementation makes a lot of sense is we're always authenticating traffic in the DMZ before we're passing anything into the corporate network. If we use the previous model, you're essentially allowing unauthenticated traffic through your DMZ and then directly to the Identity Manager server, which is then communicating to AD to authenticate your users. With this particular model, we deploy the Identity Manager connector in the corporate network. That will then go ahead and communicate to the Identity Manager tenant that's found in the DMZ. And that way we always handle authentication at the edge rather than going directly into the inside of the network. So that tends to be one of the most common implementations. If you work with our professional services organization to do an implementation, this is the route that they will probably steer you, unless you've got really good reasons that you don't want to put these components in place inside of the DMZ itself. So to go a click deeper on that, the next question that we often get is, okay, so if I do these implementations, what do I need to be thinking about in terms of ports that are going to be necessary in order for us to be able to stand up this particular implementation? So this model here is a little bit more identity manager centric because we don't have a lot of the ports that are associated with a full AirWatch implementation, and obviously we don't have a lot of the AirWatch servers that would be found in the DMZ. But this scenario here would be a user on the internet that needs access to some sort of virtual appliance that is handling the inbound egress. This could be an F5, it could be UAG. It's probably most commonly an F5s in most of the implementations that I've worked with customers to this point. And we're essentially only dealing with a couple of ports inbound. We need support, obviously, for 443 and then for PC over IP. We need support for 5262 and port 88. Each of those is used for Android mobile single sign-on and iOS single sign-on. From there, we will then be redirected to the Identity Manager appliance. The Identity Manager appliance has connectivity established to an Identity Manager connector that's on the corporate network itself. That connectivity is outbound only, and then inside of that outbound only connection, we establish a long-lived connection that's actually responsible for authenticating your end users. The only inbound traffic we would see here would be traffic that's associated with access into the Horizon environment for any external-based devices. This is designed to be kind of the bare bones implementation model for someone who's doing a POC with probably a limited set of applications which are being exposed and limited set of authentication methods that are being enabled for these end users. There's also a fantastic blog that is maintained by one of our best PSO consultants out of Sweden. His name is Peter Bjork. Peter rocks, he's fantastic. He's done some great work going ahead and putting together a set of port diagrams that he updates every single time we come out with a new release of Identity Manager and Workspace ONE. So these diagrams are designed to be all-encompassing and show all of the various capabilities that are possible if you were to turn on every feature, every authentication method, every application access that you might expose through a Workspace ONE.
That's within our ecosystem and outside. So Radius providers, RSA Secure ID, Horizon Cloud, Horizon On-Prem, AirWatch, you name it, all of those ports are listed out.
And so when we start getting into this level of detail, it starts getting pretty granular, right? Most customers would not implement all of these things. But again, this becomes a great reference for being able to say, if I were to be standing up any one of these things, what are the port considerations and the directionality of traffic that I need to take into consideration when I'm actually going in and doing this implementation? So we get to a very, very low level of detail as we start walking through this particular implementation. This implementation is showing all of the components for the Identity Manager implementation being hosted inside the corporate network. This slide moves into the scenario where we have the Identity Manager appliance behind the firewall. We have the Identity Manager connector deployed in the DMZ. And then the connector is responsible for connectivity, authentication, and authorization of end users as part of that implementation. We also include in here some of the basic ports that are necessary for Citrix integration. And then to go even one level deeper, if you're doing integration with Citrix, which is a very, very common use case for Identity Manager and Workspace ONE implementations, we have a series of components known as our connection broker for Citrix that are responsible for being able to handle entitlements coming from the Citrix storefront servers, as well as being able to generate ICAs and actually go ahead and launch those applications for us. So we didn't want to go into too much detail on here other than to provide these as references and make sure that you guys were aware of the URL of where Peter keeps this updated. So again, as new changes happen, he always makes sure to put in the late-breaking changes in ports that might be necessary for this particular type of an implementation.
Cool. What we're going to do now is change gears. So we've talked through the architecture, we've talked through how to deploy and what are the considerations you need to do around your deployment methods and the ports that you need to consider. Now, through the work that Kevin does, myself, and other people from everyone from pre-sales all the way through to solutions architecture and deployments, what we want to go through is troubleshooting this, because we run into a lot of problems at times And it's, for the most part, misconfiguration or trying to find something in the logs, and you need to know where to go. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start from the actual console. And we're going to do it two ways. So there's a couple of slides, and then we'll actually go to the console itself and go through a couple of these troubleshooting steps themselves. So the first of them is you have a systems diagnostic dashboard inside of your Identity Manager console if you deploy this on premises. All right, so it's under the dashboard there. You'll be able to get the system diagnostics information. Inside of there, you have all of the help information that you have for your particular Identity Manager environment being displayed in a nice user interface. So how many connectors you've got and whether the connectors are up. Your fully qualified domain name configurations, the connectivity out to your database, the type of database connection, the health status of it, and whether all of our connections are being done correctly. And also our public SSL certificates that we have, making sure that it's trusted and you can see whether you've got an expiry for your certificate that comes up. So if you deploy it on-prem, you'll have this. This is your first point of call to go in and say, before I start even looking at logs, let's make sure that we have valid connectivity to every one of the components that are required to run Identity Manager. The database and the connectors and the certificate that we need for public access.
So there's one other thing that's super critical about this for on-prem implementations. Obviously in a cloud-hosted world, we handle high availability. That's just part of the service. But if you're deploying on-prem, in order to get a high availability Identity Manager implementation, you need to have a 3-node cluster set up and configured. The 3 nodes are necessary in order to prevent that split brain syndrome where when you have two devices or 2 servers that can't communicate, you never know which one's going to win. When they come back online and start communicating again, that's why we have 3 required as part of these implementations. On the dashboard, you will see the health status of each node in your cluster. So if anything's not working in your environment, one of the first places that you want to go in is into the dashboard and check to make sure that the cluster health is good. We also have some APIs that can be called and used as part of a health check. Typically this is done within your load balancer for being able to go ahead, talk to the cluster and make sure that you're getting an all okay message back, indicating that all of the nodes are up at that particular point in time.
So if you're running either an on-prem or a cloud version of Identity Manager, you have a bunch of troubleshooting steps inside of the Identity Manager console itself. Firstly, from the reports and dashboard area, you'll be able to pull up your audit events and the respective reports that are built into the Identity Manager console. Again, it's across both on-prem and in the cloud, so you have all of that information to you, and it's all available, and it's for the last 90 days. Now, what it does is it provides you health information around application usage, users inside of the environment, application entitlements, the devices that are going in and accessing Identity Manager and making connections out to platforms like AirWatch, and also give you full audit events for things like SAML error connections, user authentication failures, admin authentication failures, and potentially issues that come about someone maybe trying to access it and you haven't got the correct policy set up inside of the console. So what we can do is actually go show you how this is. Hit the right button.
5.
Yep, wrong number.
Cool. So this is obviously an Identity Manager console. This is a cloud-hosted implementation, so I don't have the systems diagnostic dashboard, but what we'll typically do is start out in the user engagement dashboard. User engagement dashboard is useful for being able to come in and look at things like how many users have been synchronized into your Identity Manager environment, through the connector and talking to your Active Directory environment, number of groups, users who have logged in recently, the applications that are currently in your environment, and then how frequently those applications are being launched, and then what the adoption looks like for the various applications that you have gone ahead and published. So this becomes kind of just a snapshot point in time. Here's what's going on in the environment at this point. But what I tend to also use from a troubleshooting standpoint is under the dashboard node, if you come in and choose reports, now you can get a series of pre-canned reports that we include as part of the Identity Manager implementation. So from here, you can come in and just look at basic things and say, all right, let's look at recent activity over the past month. And we'll be able to go ahead and get a list of the things that are happening, like total logins, unique logins, resource launches, etc. And this can also be exported out to a CSV file. What I tend to do with this report more than anything else, though, is come in and look at the audit events portion of the report. So if I come in and say that I'd like to look at audit events, and I'm going to go ahead and say that I want 10 days, you obviously can come in and do things like search on a particular user. So if there's a, say a circumstance where a user says they can't log in, you can just begin typing the user's name, find that user and get all of the events that are associated with that user. And then there are various types of different items that we log as part of the service that you can come back and be able to look at. Just for brevity's sake, I'll go ahead and say let's look at all audit events. And so within this set of events, you can see that we have things like resource updates. So I, as administrator, made a change to an application. That information is going to appear in here. You can see logins, application launches, and then you can see things like the particular authentication method that was used for this login. Over on the right side, if you click on View Details, now you get more granular information that's associated with this particular audit event. So you can come in here and see things like who the user is that was responsible for authenticating, what domain it was that they were authenticating against, information about the client that they're coming from. But one of the most useful things that I tend to use in here is looking at things like IP addresses. Within Identity Manager, most people will build network ranges, and those network ranges are tied into the authentication methods to say that for more extensive authentication requirements for a user that might be on the an external network, we want to require multi-factor authentication versus just using passwords, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Coming in and being able to find source IP of where the user is coming from can give you an indication of networks you want to pay attention to.
So once you've done the basic troubleshooting through the dashboard and you're still running into issues, you have the ability to pull up things like log bundles. And so for those of you who are running a SaaS tenant, there is a log bundle that you can get via the console in the cloud that actually goes in and pulls these logs from the Identity Manager connector. If you deploy it all on-prem, you have the ability of accessing the log bundles the same way. Very, very useful, but incredibly large. There's a lot of information and a variety of different logs in there. So we're actually going to go through in a little bit and go through the specific logs that are probably most of interest here. But you get a tar file. And for those of you who are running a cloud tenant of Identity Manager and you're running into issues and you want to go talk to VMware support about it, the best way to get this is to firstly provide things like the tenant name. If there's like user authentication failures, make sure that we get the users that are listed in the applications that are not working when you upload these log files, so we can make sure that we have a time frame for when we can see those failures and help you work through troubleshooting those issues from the logs that you provide us. So make sure all of that goes into your support ticket if you do have an issue and you need us to come in and help out with looking at these particular logs.
Yeah, that's a super critical point. So the SaaS service is, it's a shared SaaS environment. So all of the tenants that are in each of those regions that I talked about before are all essentially being aggregated into the same set of logs. So if you've got a particular problem that you're running into, when you call in support, they really need to know your tenant name. So in my case, it's vmweucct.vmwareidentity.com. So the tenant name would be vmweucct. The username that's trying to authenticate is also really critical for us to have. The application that they're trying to launch becomes really critical so that we can start narrowing this down even further and further. And then the time frame in which this happens is really useful as well. We can pull logs, and sometimes it can take minutes, tens of minutes sometimes, if we try to pull a really large set of logs. So instead, we'd rather be able to narrow it down and be able to get to a particular root cause as quickly as we possibly can.
So in case you want to actually look at a specific log, and there are reasons for this, and we'll go through it, but one of the good ones is a user cannot authenticate. Instead of getting the whole log file, we can actually direct you to the right log to go get it and have a look at it. Now, if you deploy the Identity Manager connector, you have the ability to, if you're using the Windows one, just go through the Windows file system and get access to those log files. For those of you who have traditionally deployed the Identity Manager connector, the OVA file, so the Linux appliance, you need to do this through something like WinSCP. All right, so use WinSCP. The root user needs access to get those logs, but by default you don't get it. So enable root login. There's a couple of commands there to go in and do that. The path to the log file is under opt VMware Horizon workspace logs. There's a variety of different logs in there, and we've got a screenshot of it, and we'll actually show you that in the console in a moment. What you can do is just copy that file, copy the log that you specifically need, and so we'll actually, one of them that you need for things like user authentication is the connector.log. You can go in, grab that log, copy it down to your machine, and at least give that to someone like support, or you can go through and work out based upon the user and the time and the application, try and work out where there is a failure and use the logs that way. So do you want to go and show that, or
let's talk about the logs first.
Let's go through the other one. All right. So what are the kinds of logs that are probably the most important? User authentication failures, or anything that requires access to the connector itself. So the connector obviously provides you services like connecting to a Radius server or to an on-premises Kerberos provider or RSA Secure ID, or maybe even the connection out to the Citrix integration broker or the Horizon environments. Anything that uses the connector and you're having an issue there, it's the connector.log file. And so you'll get things like the timestamp, you'll get the request URL, and any exceptions that come up as part of that. All of that gets put into the logs, and you can use that as a way to troubleshoot. If you've got issues connecting from your Identity Manager Workspace ONE portal to a Horizon environment, horizon.log is the log you need to be looking at. So instead of grabbing the entire log bundle, go to WinSCP, grab the Horizon log if you're having issues connecting to the Horizon services. And perhaps the one that Kevin and I never want to hear about you guys having issues with is the greenbox.log file. So Greenbox is actually an internal name. It's not one that we should really go out there and tell a lot of people about, but you'll see it all over the logs. Greenbox is actually the unified catalog service. What it is the aggregation catalog for AirWatch applications and applications delivered in Identity Manager as part of Workspace ONE. So as you authenticate into Identity Manager for the Workspace ONE catalog, we do an API call out to AirWatch. We pull all of the user entitlements and applications from AirWatch and put them into the Workspace ONE catalog. Now, the greenbox.log is incredibly important, but often very difficult to go in and troubleshoot. So if you do have an issue with things like pulling up the unified catalog and you get an error message typically on your mobile device, there's a little blue bar down the bottom that says, could not make a connection to the MDM at this time, and then if you get that sort of error, it's typically going to be a greenbox.log issue. Make sure you grab those logs and put it into your VMware support ticket, because more often than not, Kevin and I end up having to get some of the people from R&D to help us out with trying to work out what's going on with the unified catalog service at that point. So incredibly important to have a look at, and we're actually going to go show you the log bundles now.
So on, again, either the appliance or on Windows, if you want to get directly into the logs, you basically go to the server, fully qualified domain name, :8443. The administrative side of an Identity Manager environment is always accessed over 8443 by default, CFG/logs. From there, you can go ahead and say that you want to prepare the log bundle and download it. That will then go ahead, and on Windows, it gives you a zip file, gives you a tar-z over on the Linux side. On Windows, though, you have the ability to come in and just open the file system up directly, or if you go ahead and enable root access and per the instructions we had on the previous slide and use a tool like WinSCP, you can directly navigate into the file system on either Windows or on the Linux appliance. So in this case, if I go into VMware, IDM connector, opt, VMware, Horizon, Workspace, logs, now you can see some of those logs that we were talking about before. So if I were to come in and say that it's really the connector log that we care about, I'm going to choose to right-click this one and open it in Notepad++, and start taking a look at some of the information that has been dropped into the log. So in here, you're able to come in and start looking at things like authentication attempts that are happening. You can start seeing errors. So if you have things like issues with any of the authentication adapters that the connector is using, one of the most common ones we see is it's known as password cloud deployment. If there are issues with that not working properly, you'll see errors that appear. What's really useful to do within the logs is go ahead and start searching for a couple of different keywords. If you look for warn messages, warn is an indication that something might not be properly configured, and then error will allow you to go in and look for very specific error messages that might be going on. So that tends to be a really useful kind of first place to go. If you're doing a support ticket and something is showing up as an error, what I'd usually recommend is go in, search on the username that's trying to authenticate, and grab, maybe the 10 lines before you get that particular error message, the error message itself, and then maybe the 10 lines after it, and include that as part of the support request. They may at that point say, hey, we need the full log bundle because there's something that we want to look at in one of the other many logs that we do choose to capture. So you'll see that there's a number of different logs that are going to appear. Under some circumstances, there may be relevant information in those logs that support would need to address a particular problem.
From here, now you want to go in and check things like making sure the service is up. So for the most part, we have a robust REST API framework built into both Identity Manager and into AirWatch. So you can use REST APIs to go do things like health checks of the environment. You can check on the status of things like the connector, as well as automate a lot of your functions. We've got 2 API commands there. We'll actually go in and show you what the application, the appliance health check actually shows up, so you can go through and see what the information is. All of this information around the API is public, so if you just do a Google search on VMware Identity Manager API, you'll see all of the respective APIs that you have available to you. So let me go through and we'll actually show you what running that first example there was. So we have a SaaS tenant here for Identity Manager, so we're going ksheehan.vmwareidentity.com, and then we're going to the actual REST API for the appliance health check. So Kevin, what are we getting out of this?
And so here what we get back is a JSON that includes a bunch of information that's associated with services running. Again, sometimes you'll see this integrated into a health check used by a load balancer, but this will include a number of the different parameters about how the service is currently running. You can use this to go in, and if you notice that something isn't properly operating, this might be another useful place for you to go look for information. In manner, that was just looking at the service itself. If we come in and we were to run that same query against the connector, it's a slightly different URL an API call that gets executed. Now you can again get a whole bunch of information about what specific services are configured in this environment. Again, use this that if you happen to see that something like domain join is not currently enabled and it needs to be as part of this implementation, that might give you an idea of some of the problems that you have going on. Both of these calls are unauthenticated calls, so you can use the REST API without needing to generate an OAuth token and authenticate against Identity Manager. You can just go ahead and run the call against either the connector or the service itself.
So we've talked about the appliance and the Identity Manager service of what to go in and check when you're doing your troubleshooting. The one that I typically run into all the time is people not being able to connect to their applications correctly. And that is through a variety of different things. That could be the connection from Identity Manager out to the software as a service application, all the way through to mobile single sign-on. So the rest of this is all around how do we get access into Workspace ONE, how do we do mobile single sign-on, and how do we validate that we can get access to an application. So if you're having issues inside of the Workspace ONE portal, you go click on an application and you get a single sign-on error. Right? More often than not, there is something wrong in the SAML assertion that you're sending across. There is typically a SAML issue that you need to go in and troubleshoot. And by far the easiest way is to use the SAML tracer that's built into Firefox. Other browsers have got similar services. The one in Firefox is the one that we typically use the most, and we'll actually go through and show you how this works. So the process that you need to go through when you use SAML tracer: firstly, launch the SAML tracer. Secondly, go try and do what you're trying to access and where you're getting the error. So if it is you are going from the Workspace ONE portal, click on something like Salesforce, and then you see a single sign-on error, the SAML tracer will actually go through and capture everything that's going on in that piece. And the key things that you're trying to look for is anything that gets tagged as a SAML connection, right? So that is something like either a post or a get, right? So when you're going in from an identity provider out to the app, you're doing a post connection at that point. You can go look at the respective record for the SAML connection there, and then you can go look at that SAML tracer and then go drill into specifically the SAML configuration and see what is being sent by the identity provider and whether it matches what you need to be putting into that application to get access. Now, typically, the biggest problem we see is a name ID format mismatch. You might be sending over something like username, but the application itself wants email address. That's what we see, and you can actually go, when you go into the SAML tracer, you'll see what's being posted by the IDP, and you can go map it to what the service itself, like a Salesforce or an Office 365, you can see what that actually is seeing, and then you can work out if you've got a name ID mismatch at that point. The other issues that we typically see is a misconfiguration of encryption. You may set a certain encryption standard as part of the post, but of course the service wants something else. And the third one, less so used, but often what we do see at times, is a date-time sync issue, right? Whether you're connecting to like an NTP service that's potentially off from what the cloud NTP or the cloud services are actually using. So we've got a nice little test that's actually going to run through a SAML tracer and show you a broken identity manager. So
that last point around time sync is super critical. Make sure that Identity Manager, whether it's Linux or Windows, has proper time synchronization set to an internet time source. Just a couple seconds of drift can cause SAML-based applications to break, as well as Kerberos. So me and a colleague were troubleshooting a whole bunch of Kerberos problems, and it turns out that our Windows server was 5 seconds ahead of the Identity Manager tenant. And sometimes that time sync got closer and sometimes it got further away, but 5 seconds was enough to cause Kerberos to break in a very inconsistent format for us. We needed to get very granular with the IDM team in order to look at the date timestamps to figure that particular problem out. So in this case here, I've got Firefox up. I'm accessing the tenant as just a standard user. What I'm going to do is then go ahead and start up SAML tracer, and I'm going to launch Salesforce. So the idea here is that I should be getting single sign-on into the Salesforce environment, but of course you can see that I've done something wrong with this configuration because I got an error when I tried to go in and do SSO. So if I come back into SAML tracer, we can see all of the activity that happened as part of application launch, but you'll note that I've got this little SAML indication over on the right-hand side. When I select that and then choose the SAML tab, I can actually look at the assertion that was passed between Identity Manager and the Salesforce environment and start trying to get a sense of, okay, did I get a certificate properly? Am I handing the right certificate off? Yes, it looks like I've got a good cert. If I come in and I start looking at my name IDs, we can see that the name ID format that's being handed off is just using my username. So it's sending K Sheehan. Well, Salesforce is currently set up so that it is going to require me to use email address rather than username. So I can just go back into Identity Manager environment, come into my catalog, find Salesforce, and then when I look at the configuration here for the Salesforce application, we can look down and see what our name ID format is, and I can see that it's currently set to user.username. If I instead say that I want to try changing this to user.email, set that setting and go ahead and save that, now I should be able to run SAML tracer again, return back into the console, I'd open Salesforce. In this case, I could get single sign-on working because I'm passing the right parameter. And when I come back and look inside of SAML tracer, again, I'll be able to find the assertion as it's being passed. I can look down here, check my name ID format, and in this case here, I can see that I'm actually sending my entire username. So SAML tracer is really useful for these sorts of things. Again, when you're troubleshooting date-time issues, you're going to see all of your date timestamps dropped in here. So if you need that in order to, again, make sure that your time sync is properly set up, that's usually a pretty good way to go.
So the next main issue that we typically see from an Identity Manager access portion of this is an error called IDP not found. Kevin and I will both agree this is the least descriptive error that you can find, but people see it when people try and log into the Workspace ONE portal. Either they go in, expecting to type in their username and password, and instead they get this error message that says, you cannot find your IDP, you get a 404 IDP not found. There are a bunch of different reasons for it. More often than not, the biggest one is you've got a misconfiguration in your policies. So in the policy set inside of Identity Manager, which says, based upon you coming in from this device type, what do I want to do as my method of authentication, we've often got something wrong. And the biggest one is if, for example, if you're running a cloud tenant of Identity Manager, which method of password authentication are you using? Are you using the connector, so therefore you would be using what is called in the policies password cloud deployment? Or are you using potentially another method? Are you using the API connecting out to the AirWatch Cloud connector? Right, so one of the biggest things that you do when you see things like IDP not found is go through your policy set, look at what policies have been set for each of the different operating system platforms. And what you see is make sure you validate things like the device type, make sure you look at things like the network range and the authentication methods. Now, there is a catch-all policy in there for things like web browser. Now, the best practice here is making sure you do your device-specific policies at the top and leave sort of web browser as your catch at the bottom, right? Because the way that this runs, the policies are run top to bottom, right? So it'll go through and say, in this example here, it says, is this device an iOS device? No, let me hit the next policy. Am I an Android device? No, let's hit the next policy and go on. And so, of course, web browser being the almost most basic one there, make sure that's at the bottom of your policy list at this point. Right. You've got the ability to reorder them, so they're all drag and drop. So just, if you've got a policy around the wrong way, simply just move the item from wherever you need to a higher level or lower level. When it comes to things that require access to the connector, make sure the connector is available. So go back to the system dashboard, make sure you've got the ability to connect out to your connector environment. Remember, the connector is outbound to a SaaS tenant, for example, so making sure that that connectivity is up. And make sure if you're going to use the outbound connector method, make sure you choose the right method for using password. And especially when it comes to things like network ranges, make sure that your hosted Identity Manager network ranges, you've got them well defined. It is ultimately determined by your egress IP. So if you've got a bunch of people coming from one outbound address, that's the one that we're going to see as the network range. So make sure that gets covered as part of your network ranges. Otherwise, if you don't meet the network range criteria at all, you're going to get an IDP not found error all the way through. So let's go through and just show you a policy. Have we got a policy that we want to show them? Quick. Let's go through and show them the policy while we've got it up.
So I'll kind of start off real quick by looking within the Identity Manager tenant. Again, I've gone into Identity and Access Management, and now I'm looking at the list of identity providers that we currently have configured. When you look at the various providers that are supported by the product, one of the things that is often misconfigured is the idea of looking at the what's known as the embedded identity providers that then allow us to be able to do things like that outbound connector that I talked about before. The way that you need to configure this is come into your identity providers node, come into your system. Sometimes it's called built-in identity provider. You can choose which authentication methods are going to be allowed in this environment, but then the important thing you need to do is under this connectors node, you need to add the connector that you're going to be utilizing for this outbound connection weapon, and then you need to come in and enable the password cloud deployment option. What I often see is people don't configure this properly, and they then come in and choose policies. They change the default access policy. And I'll take, for instance, the Windows 10 one. Actually, no, I'll use Workspace ONE App one here. When they're configuring the actual authentication methods which are going to be used for this particular set of auth, you'll note that there's password, local directory, password, and then password cloud deployment. You need to make sure that you have one of these selected based upon the way that you expect your end users to authenticate. In many instances, they've just chosen the wrong option, and because of the fact that people maybe are on the internet and can't directly connect to the Identity Manager appliance based on the architecture decisions that we talked about in the first couple of slides, you ensure that you're matching the appropriate option here.
And because of the flexibility, there are so many different password options. There's another one that isn't listed on yours, which is password AirWatch connector. So you can actually use the ACC to authenticate you into Identity Manager as well.
Yep.
So depending upon your deployment model, make sure you choose the right way of authenticating with username and password.
If you do see IDP not found, you can look in the connector log, and you can often find out what the user was trying to authenticate against and get an indication that maybe you don't have one of these properly set. You can also set some fallback auth methods as well. So if in the case of Win10, this is a very good example. I'm using Kerberos and VMware Verify as a multi-factor authentication method requirement for any Windows 10 based device. But if the user is external to the organization, they can't talk directly to a domain controller and they can't authenticate. So now I'm going to fall back, and instead of just giving them ID on message, I'm going to fall back and say I want to use password cloud deployment as my authentication method. And you can put an entire list of those various methods in place as you're going and defining your policies. And then, as Adarsh said, the last thing is you can reorder these by grabbing these drag handles and moving each of these around. So we typically recommend putting each of your platforms first, so Mac, iOS, Win 10, the Workspace ONE app, and then the web browser at the bottom. So the web browser kind of becomes the catch-all at the end authentication method that will be utilized.
Yes, we do. So do we support certificate-based authentication? And the answer is yes. And the way we actually do, and you've actually led quite nicely to the next point, which is, now we've talked about username, password, now it's all the mobile single sign-on stuff. So mobile single sign-on, we're going to focus on iOS, and then we're going to go talk through the Android process. So mobile single sign-on that we do for iOS is done in two parts. For the most part, it's Kerberos-based. So we're actually doing a Kerberos exchange between the iOS platform and VMware Identity Manager as the product both in the cloud or on premises. But more importantly, in order to get the appropriate authentication to the Kerberos service, you must have a certificate issued to you via your AirWatch management, for example. So the way that we do this is there is a profile configured from the AirWatch console and an integration between AirWatch and VMware Identity Manager to enable things like single sign-on. What we're ultimately using as part of this is the single sign-on framework that's been built into iOS and specifying which Kerberos realm that we want to be authenticating against. Now, typically the biggest issues we see with mobile single sign-on and the error that users get is access is denied or could not authenticate or a KDC authentication error. For the most part, it's a profile issue. Profile's been misconfigured. There hasn't been something in the profile, or the profile hasn't been deployed from AirWatch down to the device. There might be an issue with the certificate. The way that we do things like mobile single sign-on on iOS uses a certificate authority that's in the cloud. Right? So we are using a SCEP-based certificate authority. If you don't use the SCEP profile, you're never going to be able to get this to work. Things like a Kerberos realm mismatch. When you deploy, and we'll actually show you that in the console in a moment, the Kerberos realm must be in capital letters. Validate in the console and validate on the device. If it's not in capital letters, and for the cloud ones, it's VMwareIdentity.com or .eu or .asia. If it's not any of them, and it doesn't show that on the device, you're never going to get mobile single sign-on to work with our platform. The other really big one is making sure that the application bundle IDs that need to use Kerberos authentication are actually shown inside of the profile. So we want to make sure that if you're going to do Salesforce, make sure the Salesforce app bundle ID is there, the Office 365 ones. And for the native generic Safari application, make sure the Safari view controller, the view service for Safari, that bundle ID is also added in. So com.apple.mobile Safari is also listed in there. And if you're doing an on-premises KDC configuration, make sure it's being configured on the appliance. It's turned off by default. There's some documentation out there to go in and enable that and specify the realm that is there, the op.vmwareidentity.com that is for on-prem KC to enable it. And then when we go look at that and make sure you're happy with that in the console, make sure you do the same thing on the device. So triple check that you've got the certificates on there. Make sure that the certificate that you've deployed for the KDC is on the device. By default, the device will not trust it, so you've got to make sure that the device will go in and trust that. Make sure you've got the SCEP-based authority showing up in the profile and the KDC certificate. Make sure the Kerberos realm is set in uppercase and it's VMwareIdentity.com or the respective ones for other regions. And making sure that all of the application bundle IDs are actually listed down on the device. So what we can do is, if you look at a console here, we've got an iOS profile was payload, which we've uploaded the KDC certificate. This is what we're using for mobile single sign-on, and the device needs to trust this. It's a SCEP-based authority, so we have a specific template that we're using for getting access to these credentials. So we've got a credential source there, and the template that we've set up is for single sign-on. And the most important part is this actual single sign-on payload on iOS, where we see the account name, which is just a friendly name, Kerberos principal name, which is what we are generating that certificate for, and the specific realm that we're using, in this case, VMwareIdentity.com. We've got the URLs that are going to be using Kerberos authentication, but more importantly, the application bundle IDs that are allowed to do Kerberos auth. So we have things like Mobile Safari, our Salesforce bundle ID. We've got things like the Office applications and other apps that we want to be able to do mobile single sign-on for. The good thing about this is if you need to onboard a new application, just go modify the profile version. Right? Add in those other applications. AirWatch will automatically push that profile down to the device. And if you go look at the device here, Kevin's going to go in, we go into the profile setting, and so this is the best way to go in and test this out and check it. We go to the profile settings in here. We go to Workspace Services, which is the management profile that we've deployed down. If we go into the more details, you'll see a couple of things. The first of them is the single sign-on account for Kerberos. If we go into there, what we can do is make sure we see the same eligible bundle IDs that are allowed to do Kerberos authentication, given that principal name and that realm that we have set up. We'll also be able to see things like the KDC root certificate that's on the device, which is the one right down at the bottom there, which is the one that we are using so iOS can actually trust the Kerberos authentication provider that we've built into the cloud to make this work. If you're still having issues on iOS, Xcode. Right? It's really not fun, but it'll save your life. You may also need, if you have significant issues with this, make sure you grab these logs and put it into your support ticket as well. Apple have put in a GSS debugging profile. It's an enterprise profile that you can download. There's a link there, but if you just go look up GSS debugging profile for iOS, it'll actually install an additional profile onto your mobile device that when you plug the device in through Xcode, you'll actually be able to pull up Kerberos logs as well. All right, so the key thing here is once that profile has been installed, iOS will log a significant amount of traffic. So the best way to do this is clear the logs, do your test, stop logging immediately. Otherwise you'll just get a huge log file that you don't really need to have there. Now, when it comes to these sorts of logs, the most interesting part of this is that iOS has changed how it does things like Kerberos logging, and everything comes up as a notice. So we want to make sure you want to go out and look for things that are notice-based messages for Kerberos authentication. So you see on that screenshot there, we've got things like a PK init.
So the two key things to search in the logs on is the word PK init. That's basically us doing Kerberos authentication through the mechanisms provided by iOS. And then look for your KRB5 messages. The first couple up top, KRB5 is also, again, initiation of Kerberos on device. So once you see those, you can begin getting information about things like what app ID is being passed back and forth, and that can maybe identify an app which is not currently configured for SSO. And chances are, if it's iOS and it's on-prem, you probably don't have port 88 open. 88, that's almost always the biggest issue, and you'll find it straight by going through Xcode. You'll see PK init not work. Yeah. If you are doing on-premises identity manager and you need to initialize a KDC, there's a variety of steps you need to do. You need to go in and initialize it on the appliance, make sure inbound port 88 is done, and have the DNS records created for that Kerberos realm. All right, so there are steps in the VMware pubs to make this work. Make sure you follow them to the T, because that will get it and set up the integration to do the KDC authentication. The other big part is how do we get a certificate to authenticate you in? So we've got to make sure that your AirWatch environment is connected to your certificate authority. The certificate template itself has got Kerberos authentication enabled for it, so then we can use that as the way to do your KDC auth and make sure identity managers are responsible for consuming that certificate. There's about a 30-page guide that is currently in tech review that will be up on the VMware Pubs site, hopefully by the next couple of weeks, that goes into excruciating detail on how to configure an on-prem KDC. I would honestly not even try to do it on your own until such time as that paper comes, because the documentation is pretty lacking today, but this white paper is going to fix it. Last but not least, with the best part of a minute to go, is troubleshooting of Android single sign-on. Now, Android single sign-on itself is a little bit different to how we do iOS, primarily because of the lack of standardization. We use the VMware Tunnel appliance, push down proxy-based configuration for the identity manager configuration and for the mobile single sign-on payloads. So we use the certificate that's being presented out of VMware Tunnel. The challenges we typically see on Android single sign-on is more around what you have set up in the tunnel
configuration and whether that actually matches to what you need for mobile single sign-on. So the biggest one is the proxy destination not being set. So we need to go to this particular proxy service .5262. It varies when you're on premises, and the tunnel appliance not being started. Sorry, the tunnel application on the device not being started. You don't need a tunnel server. You just need the tunnel itself, the client. Make sure it's turned on. Make sure it's valid. It's done a valid authentication before you get access to it. So just in terms of the console here, we've got a list of applications there. So we're saying that...
Two things. First, we'll start with configuration.
Yep.
If you don't have AirWatch Tunnel in place, what you can do is simply go ahead and put in a BS set of configuration options. Did this with a 11111 IP address, and then said to use the certificate that's provided by the AirWatch Tunnel itself. And then come into my network traffic rules and say, for these specific applications, I want to use a proxy, and then I want to use serproxy.vmwareidentity.com:52 port number, and we go ahead and we use that in order to be able to configure. And then the important thing to do is also come in here and set a bypass rule. The bypass rule says all of the other applications should bypass that proxy and instead just go directly to the site that they're intended to authenticate against.
Otherwise,
yep.
So we went through a lot of troubleshooting. Just in terms of some of the other sessions that we have, you can obviously ignore most of everything in the blue. And there's another session this afternoon around mobile single sign-on, but there are some really nice sessions on Thursday around VMware's internal deployment, as well as securing your Workspace ONE environment. So with that, thank you very much. Please feel like we appreciate the information.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.